Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Li Shanglun. Today, I have a very special guest with us today. It's Laura Summers. How are you doing, Laura?
Hey, yeah, good. Thank you, Harry. Really good.
What did you get up to today?
Video meetings like everybody in the world. And I also took my cats out for a walk on their backpack. So they have this little backpack with a little bubble and they like to look out at the world and generally look down at the dogs. So it was a fun little excursion.
That's really cute. That's what cats do. They just look down on dogs.
Yeah.
So
It's their natural mode of being.
Yeah, exactly. I apologize to the viewers because I do recognize there is some lag, but we'll get through it together. Laura, you are somebody who's very interested in researching machine learning ethics and how we can use technology in a more ethical way. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into that and why you're interested in it?
Oh, great question. Yeah, sometimes I feel like it's me and everybody else in the world is like, oh, ML, fairness, AI, ethics, let's talk about it now. But I've been working in startups for many, many years now. And I think I've just seen some stuff that was concerning, that made me uncomfortable, basically, with the amount of responsibility we were taking for, or lack of responsibility we were taking for, the impacts of our tools in the world. And also, like, I was very aware that even though I was seeing some stuff that made me uncomfortable, that like the startups I was in was maybe like kind of small potatoes compared to some of the bigger things that are happening in the world, and the way that technology is changing the landscape of literally every industry, from journalism to driving and food. So I think it's been on my mind a lot. And also my partner's a machine learning researcher and programmer, and we just talk about it obsessively and have been for years. So yeah, a couple years ago, I just decided to get serious about it. And about a year and a half ago, I stopped working for other people and started working for myself full time to research and explore the space and see if I could come up with anything I thought might be better than what existed right now.
So you're with that Debias AI is the company that you founded. You're looking at building tools to help solve those problems that worried you in the first place when you were in the startup space. Before we go into that kind of work, I'm curious, this kind of broad question of how did you develop the ethical conscience? Like, how did you get to a position where you were able to say, actually, this disturbs me?
Yeah.
Maybe a personal question.
Well, no, it's a very good question. And I suppose I should like say, like, TLDR, I'm not an ethicist, I'm not a moral philosopher, and I try to like describe myself as ethics curious because I want to think of myself as a continual learner and not as someone who has an expertise and is telling everyone else this is how we do it. But I think probably because I've come to technology with very much a design thinking frame, and I've did a lot of design work in technology tools, a lot of the work you do there is to try and understand like how people are thinking and what they're thinking when they're using your tools, or like what their other concerns are. And you're doing this deep dive into the ethics of, or sorry, not into the ethics, obviously, Freudian slip, into the ethos of their experience. You're trying to understand what's going on with them. And I think like the more I was doing that work, the more I was feeling this like weird discomfort, because we were thinking very deeply about like optimizing a checkout flow, but then we weren't thinking at all about like the ethics of who's like, you know, putting those groceries in your box, or like the sort of deeper ecosystems. We're sort of optimizing these like user experiences in a very small, narrow domain, but really ignoring the user experience of everybody else touching the system. And it felt really lumpy and unequal to me. And so like, it's that sort of stuff that started to come up. And I've also been a technology reporter, like a volunteer reporter on RRR for many years now on a program called Bite Into It. And I think you just, you know, year in, year out, you just report on these things and you think, there has to be a better way. We have to be able to do this better. We can't just like keep letting these enormous companies get away with like harm at this scale and misuse and kind of like essentially doing what they want and not taking any notice of any kind of framework or guardrails that might protect more common goods. So I think, you know, after many years of doing that kind of reporting and seeing things just really land cause harm, and for them only to like pull back a little bit once there's a huge PR nightmare, you just think this can't be the only way to build a technology industry. There has to be a better way. And like we see other industries that are older than tech or older than like, you know, internet tech or app tech, who've had to go through this pain. So I feel like we're not new in our pain, but maybe we're new in the fact that we still haven't gotten over the hubris of thinking we can do it better than everybody else.
Right. And it feels like there's just so much more power being concentrated in these new technologies that really dramatically changes the necessity of these questions.
Precisely. And it's power from a capital point of view and power from an impact and scope point of view.
Something that struck me in what you were saying is like you became aware of the lumpy inequalities, I think was the word you used, when you started looking at the broader context rather than just like isolating this one thing that you were trying to optimize for. And that feels to me like a really great, it like points to the capitalism's central weaknesses of like, oh, we're really good at just optimizing a particular metric, like, I don't know, money for shareholders, at the cost of a lot of other things.
Yeah.
Can you take us, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, we love to like sort of push a lot of problems like under the table by saying, oh, it's about optimizing for the bottom line. Like it seems to sort of cover like this whole world of problems, and we're just like, oh, well, we have to do it. And you think, well, actually, we don't. Like there are still choices. We can have like differences of ways of getting to like that kind of improved bottom line. And I like to keep, I've been telling a lot of people, because I'm going on and on about capitalism recently, not all profit is created equal. And like, we have to really grapple with that. Like not all profit is equally acceptable to us, will make us feel good about ourselves. And not all profit necessarily means that we've improved the world. So I think we have to get serious about like, you know, no longer just lionizing profit as like the only goal and the most important goal.
That's such a great articulation. Not all profit is equal. I am curious about, the work that you've been doing to solve some of the problems. Can you take us through a very like paintbrushy picture of the problems that you perceive in machine learning, in technology? Yeah.
Well, okay. I guess like more broadly in tech, like there's often this sort of focus on, when you do this thing called backlog grooming, where you have like a card wall or a digital card wall full of features, and you're thinking, which one do we want to prioritize next? All of the techniques and the processes that people use in tech to think about prioritization focus on the upside or the intended benefit or the intended like outcome. So I'm going to make it easier to do X and Y, or I'm going to make the customer like get through this process 2% faster. Whatever I think is going to happen, I'm thinking about like what's the improvement, but we almost never do the work of trying to think about what could go wrong. Like, what if we had a bad actor and they're trying to game the system? Or what if like I'm capturing, all this new data and then we leak it in the transaction between the client and the server? So we don't necessarily think about these like failure cases or these downsides in the process of grooming or thinking about like how to prioritize work, which means that we don't necessarily seriously like get the cost of building that thing right, because we only think about the cost to get to the perceived upside as opposed to the cost to get to the perceived upside without the downside. That makes sense. So I think like that's maybe a good sort of broad strokes way of thinking about like how easy it is to miss or to forget about a lot of things if you're only focusing on the sort of like, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, essentially. And then more specifically in machine learning, we have this thing essentially happening with deep learning systems, especially where we don't actually get context. Like we have these like magic black boxes and we put data in and we get inferences or classifications or predictions out the other side. But many of them, we don't really understand what's going on in here. And we know for sure that what's going on in here is not like a contextual understanding of the world. Like we don't understand the history of harms that might have affected the people or the data from the people that's going into that system. So whatever's coming out doesn't have any sense of time, place, history, and it doesn't know. Like, so for an example, when we talk about that Google photo system that classified two Black kids in the park as gorillas, that system didn't have some kind of like nefarious like agenda to say, oh, I'm classifying them something which is like historically been a racial slur and is incredibly, incredibly offensive. It was literally a mistake. But the sort of the effect and the impact of people like seeing those kinds of slurs being propagated in a big public system like a Google photo image, like you can't necessarily like quantify or measure the impact of that, but you know that like it wasn't because the system had some kind of racist context. It was because the system had no context at all, and it had no guardrails in place to try and look for those kinds of problems.
So is it fair to say that when systems don't have context, so like that, it's not that they're then become magically apolitical. It's like they take on the values of either like the data set or the rules that were used to create them. Is that what's happening here?
That's a perfect summary. And even to extend on that, like they take on whatever's happened before and whatever rules or heuristics are getting baked into the model, and then they amplify them. So like whatever's happened in the past, it's like, think about any snippet of history. If you wanted to like take that snippet of history, like shrink it down, simplify it, and then like reduce it like stock until it's really strong. Like that's kind of how I think about data going through a machine learning system. Like it gets really like, it increases the flavor. So whatever was happening before is only going to be happening more. So a good example we talk about all the time is like the Amazon classifier that was trying to scan resumes to look for engineers, and it very quickly became sexist, and it very quickly like basically as soon as it saw like any female pronouns or any like I think it was looking at groups and activities that were like feminine, had feminine names in them. So like Girl Scouts versus Boy Scouts, that kind of thing. It was basically like discounting that candidate immediately. And like, it doesn't take a lot of detective work to work out what happened. Like they essentially were saying, well, hey, if we're going to try and learn what a good resume is based on the history of who's applied to be an engineer at Amazon, we know that's been something like 90% men. So, and like, we know that like the percentage of women in their engineering departments overall is a very, very small percentile. So the system isn't being sexist per se, it's just propagating the pattern it's already learned from the data.
It's worth like this reminds me very strongly of the fact that this problem happens in a similar situation, like outside of machine learning, just in everyday legal systems. If there's, I don't know, say a car crash and a young child dies, then the family might be entitled to compensation, and the amount of compensation is very different if the child was like a white boy as opposed to a black girl, which is absolutely ludicrous. But it's again the thing of like, how do we set up the system such that it's fair? Do you have to go by like historical entitlement to lifetime earnings and choose to stratify by those things like gender and race? Anyway, it just like came to my mind of, even if you take away the technology, we're still facing the same problems. It's
totally true. And I have a friend, KDM, he just opened a research institute called the New Design Congress, and they're basically like researching the impacts of new technologies and like with a strong focus on machine learning. And he likes to say that there's no new problems being introduced by machine learning. We're just amplifying or accelerating these existing social inequalities, like particularly socioeconomic status and like the stratification of class, essentially, usually across race lines. But yeah, like I'm very much of the opinion we don't have new problems, we just have an amplification of the problems. And again, like when you think about what's happening in machine learning, it's not necessarily making a normative claim about whether it's right or wrong that the man or the woman gets the engineering job. It's just copying the patterns it's learned and propagating them forwards.
So what is your response to all this? You've been creating tools that tackle these problems.
Yeah, so I've been working with teams, particularly for the past sort of half year or so, to embed in decision science, data science kinds of teams to try and explore what are the tools we need. So I've been working on things like bias mapping tools, and there's a whole bunch of stuff happening out in the world. And recently I released a project called Ethics Litmus Tests, which I will show you a little. I'm not doing a very good job of showing it off here. Which is basically I'm not doing a good job of centering it. There it is. it's a little card deck, and I basically was like, I found myself asking the same questions of myself over and over again, and I thought, perhaps this would be something that would be nice to have like as a physical artifact and just like make sure. And I was thinking about litmus tests, and I was watching The Good Place. I don't know if you've seen that. It's
Yeah, I finished all the episodes.
yeah, how good is it, right? Like I think it does something really clever, which it takes like these often dour, often heavy questions of like morality and ethics, and it lightens them up and it makes them accessible. And it like I love the Jason character because he just takes all of these like ridiculous moral philosophy like quandaries, and then he's like, oh yeah, it's like that time that Debbie like stole my gator, and it's like it's
yeah. But
right,
it's performing an important function, you're saying. It's like, it's making it accessible, it's making it fun.
Exactly. And it makes it up to date, and it makes it something that like is relevant to, today's youth. It makes me sound incredibly old, but yes, like but like it's actually really important that we can see ourselves in these systems and in these scenarios. So like if we're trying to grapple with deep questions of ethics, and it feels like all of the examples we're being offered come from some like faraway land that has no bearing on the actual problems we experience, it's like very alienating. Yeah, so I wanted to put something in people's hands, and I thought it was nice to have a little artifact people could have on their desk, and it does this sort of job of holding space and saying, hey, you need to remember ethics. You need to make sure you have these questions coming back up. And I think like I thought a little bit when I was first designing it of maybe it should be an app, maybe it's just something that you pull up on your phone. But I kept coming back to a physical artifact because I thought it was really nice that it just sat there and it was attractive and easy to play with and held space, and it wasn't. And I also like the idea that it was sort of kind of game-like, so it wasn't too serious. It wasn't too like, oh, it's this 60-page strategy document I have to read, which is something I see a lot of in this space. Like people are putting together this very long, very dense, very hard to get through strategy documents or principles documents, and then expect people to like winnow out some kind of magic value from it. And I think, what does it have to do with your day-to-day decision making?
I think there's a nice parallel in trying to put these really big ethical quandaries into something much more playable, something a bit provocative, something that you're encouraging people to use on a daily or kind of more regular basis. And then like the way that you've made that physical allows for that playfulness, allows for the sensation of like, oh yeah, I'm physically grappling with the problems now.
Exactly.
So what are the cards?
So the cards they're all little prompts or provocations. And I just wanted to show you that I did a little bit of fun designing on them. So they all have their own different, not doing a good job of centering it. There's quite a lot of designs in there. And I had a lot of fun thinking about like the colors that you get when you dip a litmus. I don't know if you remember from chemistry, but like dipping the litmus cards into the solution and finding out if it's acidic and basic and seeing like that color run across it. But yeah, it's a bunch of questions that sort of help us like, get outside that like little race we run in our head of like, oh, is this okay or not? Or oh, should I say something? So it's just ways of reframing or helping us like poke at the problem from a different angle and like, do a little bit of internal assessment. So questions like, what if it happened to me? Or would I want my close relative to hear about this? Or what are some other good ones? Is this something I'd want to be known for in the future? So
the first question is almost like a Rawlsian thing of like, if you were in every position in society, what could go wrong? And then the second one is like bringing it more about interpersonal ethics, or like, relatives brings to mind traditionalism.
Yeah, and maybe contractualism in some cases as well. You think about like, actually, I have one that's a specific call to contractualism, which is, what do we owe to each other?
Hey, Chiriane Gagne.
Exactly.
Well,
look, yeah, also the original author, but yes.
But more importantly,
Chidi. But yeah, I thought like I wasn't trying to pitch some specific viewpoint of this is the appropriate way to think about ethics. And in fact, like what I'm just trying to do is help people build up that practice, that habit for themselves of interrogating those feelings as they come up and like having something to do that isn't just like shove it back down and ignore it, basically.
I really like this framing as ethics as something you practice, these little habits that you're trying to build, because the next question I have is, what does it mean to implement these things in the corporate structures that were talking about earlier? The problems seem to be bigger than just like our individual ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, one of the things I've done with the facilitation notes is come up with a way that you can help teams map like their overall ethics responses to a question or to a feature. So I think one of the things that we're not doing in work in general, but especially in technology, is externalizing our personal ethics and then comparing them to the person next to us and the other people in our team. So I'm also hoping to help facilitate that work of like, well, I feel this, but with this little caveat, and you're like, oh, well, I'd actually take it this way. And like, we often sort of think that we agree in the broad, but then disagree on like little subtle distinctions. And I think it's quite problematic if we don't externalize those distinctions and like talk them through. And, often you can find a really useful way forward, but it's like anything. The more implicit, the more problematic, the easier it is to like get confused or fail to like understand those underlying assumptions.
It reminds me that, it's the invisible power structures that are the most pernicious, right? If they're not expressed.
Precisely. So aside from doing this kind of activity, I'm exploring lots of different tools that help map bias and map like the type of harm that might be caused by that bias. In general, my approach is thinking about how we can do this thing called habit stacking. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a thing that comes from a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, which was one of the other inspirations for this project. But basically the idea of habit stacking is just like, if you're already doing something, you've got some process in place or some, like say you're getting up every morning and you're doing your emails for 15 minutes to like get, pay down your email debt. You're like, okay, at the end of the email pay down debt, I'm going to spend 5 minutes meditating because I need to pay down my mental health debt as well. So the idea is that you try and stack a habit that you want to build on top of a habit that's already running nicely, so that you don't have to necessarily like find a new time and place or like force yourself to create this whole new thing happening in your life and make it consistent. So to make that real in corporate space, that means can we ask some sticky questions about our feature at the kickoff meeting? Can we do a harm assessment and mapping process at the scoping process? Can we do some risk analysis and risk sizing when we like do our sizing to see how long it's going to take to build the thing? So like trying to find ways to like fit these sort of newer processes we need to fit in on top of the existing process already in place.
Nice, I like that. So it's like habit stacking, but corporate process version.
Yeah, corporate process style, like agile style, which is, everyone does their own agile thing and it's all a bit different, but we'd like to talk about retros. We like to talk about. I
have no idea what retros are.
Oh, yeah, retro is a thing that everyone in tech seems obsessed with, but it basically means that at the end of some given period of time that you've been working together with your team, usually 2 weeks, sometimes it's a week or a bit longer, you should have delivered some chunk of work. And the idea is that you take an hour or so, maybe less, and just do a quick like check-in with the team, like what went wrong, what perceptions like got surfaced, what would you like to know for next time. So you're just trying to like essentially do a little review of how you went and pick up any learnings or any things that like need to be refined for the next time around.
Okay, I'm assuming it stands for retrospective then.
Exactly.
I have one last question, which I guess relates to, we've been talking a lot about ethics as it relates to personal and as it relates to corporations. And the interplay of these is really fascinating because it feels like we're in a new era where our ethics, ethical institutions of the past, like religious organizations, have less relevance in modern society. What does this mean for the absence of these kind of moral? I don't want to use the word overlords, but like arbitrators.
Moral teapots in the sky.
Yeah, right. Well, and now our moral overlords are like Facebook, etc.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I've seen some very interesting analysis on this, and I think it's very much a question still to be explored and still to be grappled with, like sort of culturally and societally, where we see this thing where people are essentially deferring their personal like ethics or their personal sense of what is right and wrong to their boss or to the strategic planning of like the C-suite. So we see people like saying, well, if my company is doing it, then it must be okay. And that's really bad tautological logic, right? Like we can't just say, well, if the company's doing it, it's all right, because that's how we see lots of stuff go wrong. We need to actually like ask ourselves these hard questions of like, what do we think is acceptable? What if it happened to my mom? Would I feel okay about it then? What if what if it made someone who was already vulnerable or already like not doing well, like be worse off? Is that okay? Is that okay in the pursuit of the bottom line? Like, and that thing we were talking about where not all profit should be or is equal. Like, I think we have to like really grapple with that and ask ourselves the questions of how much profit might we be willing to trade off for feeling better or feeling happy with the outcome of our system. There's a really good talk by an engineer whose name I've just blanked on, of course, but I'll think of it in a second, who was talking about these, they were basically mapping these different measures of bias that, or sorry, of fairness that have been defined. So there's a whole bunch of them. There's like equal opportunity, and there's equal or demographic parity. There's literally over a dozen mathematical definitions of fairness sort of floating around, competing for primacy in the space. And she mapped them and showed how if you looked at them compared to how much income you could make if you were optimizing for all of them, how none of them are sort of on the same exact line, and none of them also matched the sort of ideal or highest profit for the system that she was exploring. Her name is Finn Lattimore. I worked it out.
Nice.
But I think it's a really tangible and useful, like an important thing that we have to grapple with, which is that optimum profit will definitely not be optimum fairness or optimum equality or optimum like ethical outcome. So I think we actually do have to ask ourselves these questions, like how much profit can we let go of in order to make sure we're doing something in the world that we feel is acceptable, is okay, is something that we want to see happening in 5 years' time and in 50 years' time, and not just for the next 5 months.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I hope that we can reach a point in time when people, I guess both individually, collectively, can start to embed these habits into our corporations and everyday life. And it also sounds like the stuff that you're doing has a kind of like the aesthetics of ethics are being considered in the same way they were talking about with The Good Place, where, making it accessible, making it something attractive to think about is part of what you do as well.
Yeah, and I'm certainly of the opinion that why would you make an ugly, inaccessible, hard to approach tool if you could make something that was pretty and attractive and people wanted to pick up and play with? I think like there's nothing wrong with playing to human nature, essentially, and trying to bring every tool to bear to help encourage people to do the work. And also I think there's something to be said for taking it a little bit lightly and not being too serious. Like we don't want to be like, oh, there's a right and a wrong answer, and if you get the wrong answer, you're a terrible person. Because like that's kind of
it can feel that way sometimes with like
yeah.
Wokeness or with cancel culture. It's like I can see why those things are present, but it's also sometimes really damaging.
Yeah, and can I just say that like that wokeness and that cancel culture, they are like direct parallels to religious fundamentalism and self-righteousness. And we're not doing a better job if we're like just as nasty as like the nasty religious bigots from like 2 generations ago. So I think we have to be really serious about like holding up that kind of impulse in ourselves and not trying to be like holier than thou or more woke than thou.
I feel like that really circles back so nicely to one of the very first few things that you said, which is like, you don't present yourself as an ethicist or a moral philosopher. You're just somebody who's ethics curious. And I hope that I can be more ethics curious like you.
Thanks, Harry.
It's been such a pleasure chatting with you, Laura. Thank you so much for your time.
I had a great time.
Awesome. Well, take care and stay safe.
And you, have a good night.
Bye. Have a good night. You're watching The Distillery, a series of online interviews. New episodes are streamed every day, and you can check out past episodes and future guests on our website, distillery.site, or on our Instagram @distillery.site, and get announcements on Twitter @distillery_site. All these very ethical platforms. Great. Well, catch you soon and take care.